Imagine spending nearly 3 decades fighting for every scrap of legitimacy, begging for primetime slots, watching sponsors walk away, playing in half-empty arenas while the sports world largely looked the other way. Then, after all that struggle, after all that pain, the universe hands you exactly what you've been praying for. Not just a good player, not just a marketable face, a full-blown cultural earthquake in sneakers. A once-in-a-generation phenomenon who single-handedly makes millions of people care about your league for the very first time. And then, you watch the people running that league do everything in their power to destroy her. That's not a hypothetical. That's exactly what happened. And the deeper you dig into the real story behind Caitlyn Clark's first year in the WNBA, the more disturbing it gets. Because this wasn't just about one roster spot, one cheap shot, or one tone-deaf press conference. This was a systematic, multi-layered unraveling that exposed something rotten at the very core of women's professional basketball's leadership. Something that, if left unchecked, could haunt the league for the next 2 decades. The truth involves jealousy so naked it made national headlines, political maneuvering so clumsy it insulted the intelligence of every fan watching, and a commissioner who, when handed the defining moment of her tenure, chose to protect the feelings of a handful of veterans over the future of an entire sport. Buckle in, because this story is messier, uglier, and far more revealing than anything you've seen covered on the surface. When Caitlyn Clark walked onto a college basketball court, something happened that the sports world hadn't seen in a very long time. People who had never watched a single women's basketball game in their lives suddenly couldn't look away. It wasn't manufactured, it wasn't a marketing campaign, it was organic, unstoppable, and almost impossible to fully explain unless you actually watched her play. The numbers alone are staggering. The 2024 NCAA Women's Championship game, Clark's final appearance, drew an astounding 24 million viewers. Let that sink in for a moment. 24 million people watching a women's college basketball game. The average viewership across the entire tournament run was 18.9 million. To put that in the kind of context that makes your jaw drop, more Americans watched that game than watched the NBA Finals that same year. More than the final rounds of the Masters, more than the deciding games of the World Series. This wasn't a women's sports record. This was an all-sports record, a number that embarrassed leagues with 100-year histories and billion-dollar TV contracts. And every single one of those viewers was tuning in specifically to watch one person. Clark's game was unlike anything women's basketball had produced before. The logo threes from well beyond the arc, the no-look passes that seemed to come from a completely different dimension of awareness, the fearless, almost reckless confidence of someone who genuinely believed every shot was going in before it left her hand. She played with a swagger that felt simultaneously old school and completely new, and audiences responded to it the way they respond to once-in-a-generation talents, with obsession. So, when the WNBA draft came around and the Indiana Fever, a franchise that had been largely irrelevant for years, locked in the first overall pick and called her name, the expectation was clear. The league was about to be transformed. Everyone could feel it coming. The Fever, an organization that had struggled to fill seats and generate buzz for the better part of a decade, suddenly became the most talked about team in women's professional sports overnight. What followed was nothing short of extraordinary. Clark's first professional debut on ESPN2 became the most-watched WNBA game in more than 20 years. Franchises that had spent years playing in intimate, partially empty arenas started scrambling to move their home games against the Fever into massive NBA-sized stadiums just to handle the demand. Her number 22 jersey sold out within an hour of the draft. And not just sold out among Fever merchandise, it outsold the combined jersey sales of every other player across every other team in the entire league. Every single one. Combined. The league was also forced to seriously address a long-avoided topic, chartering private flights for players. The logistical nightmare of moving the most famous female athlete on the planet through commercial airports became too obvious to ignore. That conversation alone marked a turning point in how the league was forced to think about its infrastructure, its players, and its future. Sponsors who had been lukewarm on the WNBA for years suddenly started calling. TV executives who previously treated women's basketball as a scheduling afterthought were now renegotiating deals with a completely different sense of urgency. The average viewership across Clark's debut season reached 2.1 million, a number that would have seemed like a fantasy just 12 months earlier.
This was the Caitlyn Clark effect. Real, quantifiable, and absolutely historic. The league hadn't just gained a star player, it had gained a cultural phenomenon capable of reshaping the entire landscape of women's professional sports in America. And that's precisely where the darkness began. There's a version of this story where the WNBA's established players look at Caitlyn Clark's arrival and see exactly what it is: the rising tide that lifts all boats. More viewers means more sponsorship. More sponsorship means bigger contracts. Bigger contracts means better facilities, better travel, better everything. The math is simple. The logic is airtight. That version of the story didn't happen. Instead, what Clark encountered from the moment she stepped onto a professional court felt less like a competitive challenge and more like an organized campaign. The physicality directed at her went well beyond what any rookie, even a highly touted #1 overall pick, should reasonably expect. Standard initiation in professional sports involves tough defense, veteran presence, and the occasional hard foul that communicates expectations. What Clark experienced was something categorically different. She was elbowed in situations where elbows had no basketball justification. She was shoulder-checked when she wasn't even involved in the play. She was knocked to the hardwood repeatedly in moments that referees seemed almost reluctant to call, as if there was an unspoken collective agreement that this particular player needed to be brought down a peg, and the officials were willing to quietly participate. But one moment cut through all the noise and forced the entire country to stop and pay attention. During a nationally televised game against the Chicago Sky, Caitlyn Clark was standing near the action, not defending, not involved in the play, simply occupying space on the court. Kennedy Carter approached her without warning and delivered a vicious shoulder check that sent Clark crashing to the floor. There was no ball in the vicinity. There was no basketball reason for the contact. Carter then stood over her and exchanged words in what witnesses described as a deliberate taunt. The backlash was immediate and volcanic. Within hours, the league was forced to step in and retroactively upgrade the call to a flagrant 1 foul, an extraordinarily rare after-the-fact acknowledgement that the officiating in the moment had failed completely. But the damage was already done. Millions of people had watched it happen live. Millions more saw the replay on social media within hours. And then came the detail that transformed a bad moment into a full-blown scandal. Angel Reese, Clark's well-known collegiate rival from their heated LSU versus Iowa history, was captured on camera leaping off the bench and visibly celebrating the hit. Not cheering a great defensive play, not reacting to a momentum shift, celebrating a cheap shot on a player who was standing still, not even in the action. The message being sent was unmistakable, and it wasn't subtle. The league's established players were not welcoming Caitlyn Clark, they were targeting her, and they were doing it publicly on national television with a confidence that suggested they weren't worried about consequences. That kind of boldness doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from an environment where that behavior has been quietly tolerated, if not implicitly encouraged. The question that started spreading across sports media, living rooms, and social feeds wasn't just about 1 foul or 1 shove. It was bigger and more unsettling than that. Why were veteran players in a league that desperately needed growth actively working to intimidate and humiliate the one person driving that growth? What kind of internal culture produces that reaction? And more critically, where was the leadership?
Those questions were about to get a very revealing answer. For months leading up to the 2024 Paris Olympics, the assumption that Caitlyn Clark would represent Team USA was so widespread, so universally accepted across sports media, that it barely felt like a question worth asking. Analysts discussed her presence on the roster the same way they discussed gravity, not as a possibility, but as a simple feature of the landscape. And the reasoning went beyond her obvious talent. The Olympics represent the single largest sporting platform on Earth. Billions of people across dozens of countries tune in to watch events they'd otherwise never follow. For a league like the WNBA, which had spent years trying to crack into mainstream consciousness, the Paris Games represented something priceless, a chance to introduce their sport, and specifically their brightest star, to a genuinely global audience. Clark's deep-range shooting would have been devastatingly effective against the zone defenses common in international play. Her name recognition was already expanding beyond American borders. The cultural moment was perfectly aligned.
NBC executives who held the Olympic broadcast rights reportedly could barely contain their excitement at the prospect of Clark on the Olympic stage. The narrative writes itself. America's most exciting new basketball talent competing for gold with the whole world watching. The Caitlyn camera would have been a constant presence, drawing in casual viewers who had never watched a WNBA game but had heard the name, seen the highlights, and felt curious. Sports marketing analysts estimated that Clark's inclusion could have generated hundreds of millions of dollars in incremental viewership value, sponsorship exposure, and long-term brand equity for women's basketball internationally. This wasn't a sentimental argument about rewarding popularity. It was a cold, calculated business case with overwhelming numbers behind it. And then, on a quiet Saturday morning, the roster dropped. 12 names. Every major media outlet had the list within minutes. Journalists, fans, and analysts scanned it rapidly, looking for the name that everyone assumed would be there. It wasn't. Caitlyn Clark had been left off the United States women's Olympic basketball team. The reaction was not measured or gradual. It was instant and explosive. Social media didn't slowly build toward outrage. It detonated. Sports talk radio segments that had been scheduled on completely different topics were abandoned mid-show. Cable news networks that rarely touched women's basketball were running breaking news banners. The story jumped out of the sports section entirely and landed on front pages, trending topics, and dinner table conversations across the country. People who had discovered the WNBA specifically because of Caitlyn Clark felt the exclusion personally. These were new fans, people who had been welcomed into the sport by one player's magnetic presence, who now received the unmistakable message that the establishment didn't particularly want them or their favorite player on the biggest stage available. It was a self-inflicted wound of staggering proportions, and the explanation that followed made everything dramatically worse. When an organization makes a decision that defies public logic on that scale, the explanation matters enormously. A well-crafted, honest, and thoughtful response can't undo the damage, but it can at least demonstrate that the people in charge understand what happened and why it generated such a powerful reaction. USA Basketball's selection committee offered none of that. What they provided instead was a collection of justifications so transparently weak that they functioned less as explanations and more as an accidental confession. The first argument, leaked carefully through anonymous sources rather than stated directly and publicly, was that Clark lacked sufficient professional experience at the time of selection. She had only played a handful of WNBA games, the reasoning went, and the Olympic team required proven professionals. Sports historians needed approximately 45 seconds to dismantle that entirely. Candace Parker made the Olympic team in 2008 as a rookie. Breanna Stewart made it in 2016 as a rookie. Both were selected before they had accumulated significant professional experience, and both were celebrated for it. The precedent wasn't just present, it was recent and well documented.
The experience argument didn't survive its first serious examination. The second justification was even more revealing in what it accidentally admitted. Unnamed sources emphasized the importance of team chemistry, suggesting that introducing a player with Clark's level of media attention could disrupt the established dynamic of the veteran group. The implication was uncomfortable but clear. Some of the players already on the team didn't want Clark there, and the committee had accommodated that preference. Read that again slowly. The selection committee for the United States Olympic team may have excluded the most marketable and widely watched player in the sport because veteran players found her presence inconvenient. The name that surfaced most frequently in those discussions was Diana Taurasi, a genuine legend of the sport, undeniably one of the greatest to ever play the game, and by her own public statements and on-court demeanor, clearly not someone who had made peace with the idea of stepping aside for a new generation. Reports suggested that Taurasi's influence within the team's inner circle carried significant weight in the selection process, and that her relationship with Clark's potential inclusion was something less than enthusiastic. This is where the story stops being about basketball entirely and starts being about something much more familiar: power, legacy, and the very human unwillingness to share a spotlight that has been yours for a long time. The committee's fear was also palpable in what was left unsaid. They were terrified of the media attention Clark would bring to Paris, terrified of the questions about playing time, terrified of what happens when a coach doesn't give the most famous player on the team enough minutes and millions of fans notice and react. The easier path in their calculation was simply to leave her at home and deal with the public anger, which they clearly assumed would fade. It didn't. It metastasized. Every crisis carries within it an opportunity for leadership. The moments that define organizations and the people running them are almost never the comfortable ones. They are the fires, the controversies, the situations that demand someone stand up, take ownership, and demonstrate through action rather than corporate language that they understand what is at stake. Kathy Engelbert had one of those moments, and what she did with it will likely define her legacy as WNBA Commissioner in ways she never anticipated.
As the Clark Olympic snub dominated sports news cycles for days and then weeks, all eyes turned to the commissioner's office. Engelbert was in a position that, while uncomfortable, was also genuinely powerful. She had a microphone, a platform, and the institutional authority to reshape the narrative. She could have stood before cameras and said, plainly and boldly, that Caitlyn Clark is the most important player to enter this league in a generation, that her exclusion from the Olympic team was a mistake this organization acknowledges, and that the WNBA is committed to building around her talent and her fan base for the next 20 years. That statement, or anything resembling it, would have been honest. It would have been strategically smart. It would have demonstrated to the millions of new fans who were watching closely that the league understood what it had in Clark and was determined to protect it. Instead, Engelbert chose a different path, a path that managed to alienate almost everyone simultaneously. Her public responses were careful to the point of being meaningless. She praised the athletes who made the Olympic team, which was appropriate but not what anyone was asking about. She spoke in general terms about the selection committee's process and its integrity, which deflected rather than addressed the actual controversy. She offered no acknowledgement of the cultural and financial magnitude of Clark's exclusion. She said, through her careful, structured non-answers, that the decision had been made, the process had been followed, and the conversation was effectively over. The subtext was deafening. The league's most powerful executive had looked at the biggest PR crisis of her tenure, a crisis rooted in internal jealousy and political maneuvering that was actively harming the league's relationship with millions of new fans, and had chosen to protect the people who caused the crisis rather than the asset they had damaged. It wasn't passive, it was a choice. A deliberate, calculated decision to prioritize the comfort of the league's old guard over the future that Clark represented. And the fans who had been so energized, so genuinely excited about what women's basketball was becoming, received that message with a clarity that no amount of corporate language could obscure.
What Engelbert's response communicated, loudly and unmistakably, was that the WNBA's leadership was not prepared to fight for its own future. That when the moment came to choose between protecting established power structures and embracing transformational change, the establishment would win, every single time. That realization landed hard. Strip away the emotions, the personal grievances, and the cultural politics for a moment, and look at what happened here through the cold, unforgiving lens of business, because the financial implications of the WNBA's handling of Caitlyn Clark are not just significant, they are potentially catastrophic in their long-term impact. Start with the Olympics. The Paris Games drew a global audience of billions across every participating sport. For a league that had been fighting for international relevance since its founding in 1997, the opportunity to put its most famous, most charismatic, most broadly appealing player in front of that audience was not just valuable, it was, arguably, the single greatest marketing opportunity in the history of the sport. Conservative estimates from sports marketing analysts suggested that Clark's presence on the Olympic team, combined with the inevitable media narrative around her, could have generated somewhere between $300 million and $500 million in incremental brand value for women's basketball globally. That's not ticket sales or jersey revenue. That's the compounding, long-tail value of introducing a new audience to a sport, an audience that then follows at home, buys merchandise, watches on television, and eventually fills arenas. All of it gone because a selection committee couldn't navigate the politics of veteran ego, and a commissioner couldn't find the courage to say the obvious thing out loud. The jersey revenue loss is almost insultingly small in comparison, but it's still instructive. Clark's number 22 had already outsold the entire rest of the league combined. An Olympic run would have expanded that market internationally in ways that are genuinely difficult to calculate. International fans who discover a player at the Olympics don't just watch highlights. They buy merchandise, they subscribe to streaming services, they travel to games. They become the kind of deeply invested fans that sustain leagues through lean years. The WNBA chose to not have any of that.
And the cruelest irony of all is that the players who pushed back against Clark's inclusion, who benefited most from the league's decision to protect their status and their comfort, are the ones who ultimately paid the highest price. Because the growth that Clark's presence was generating, the better travel, the bigger arenas, the improved contracts, the legitimate mainstream attention, was growth that would have lifted every single player's standing and earning potential. They didn't just hurt Caitlyn Clark, they hurt themselves, and they did it with their eyes open. It would be convenient and perhaps comforting to frame everything that happened as a series of individual bad decisions, a committee that got one roster wrong, a commissioner who handled one press cycle poorly, a handful of veteran players who got territorial in a way that crossed a line, isolated incidents, correctable mistakes, lessons learned for next time. But the pattern doesn't support that reading, not even close. What the Caitlyn Clark saga revealed is a deeply embedded cultural problem within the structures that govern women's professional basketball. A problem rooted in scarcity thinking, the belief, held at almost every level of the organization, that there is only so much attention available, only so much space at the top, and that the arrival of someone new and enormously popular necessarily comes at the expense of everyone already there. That scarcity mindset is understandable, in a way, given the history. The WNBA was built on the backs of players who fought for every inch of recognition in a sports landscape that was openly hostile to women's athletics for decades. Those players and the culture they created were forged in an environment where fighting to protect your position was a survival strategy. The instinct to guard against newcomers was not irrational, it was adaptive given the circumstances. But those circumstances changed the moment Caitlyn Clark walked through the door. The scarcity that had defined the league's entire existence was suddenly, dramatically no longer real. There was more than enough attention, there was more than enough money, there was more than enough room for everyone and then some.
The pie wasn't being divided differently. The pie was getting bigger at a rate the league had never experienced. And the leadership, the veterans, and the institutional structures couldn't make that cognitive shift. They kept responding to abundance with the defensive instincts of scarcity. And in doing so, they turned the most powerful tailwind in the league's history into a headwind. The commissioner's failure is perhaps the most damning piece of all of this, because her job, above everything else, is to see beyond the immediate political pressures and make decisions in the long-term interest of the league. That's what leadership is. Engelbert had access to the same viewership data everyone else did. She could see the jersey sales. She could read the media coverage. She understood, at least intellectually, what the Clark effect represented and what losing it could cost. And she still chose the path of least internal resistance over the path of greatest long-term benefit. Leagues don't collapse overnight. They erode. They lose relevance gradually through a series of small decisions that each seem manageable in the moment, but compound into something irreversible over time. The WNBA had been on that erosion curve for years before Clark arrived and temporarily reversed it. The decision to mishandle her arrival, to tolerate the targeting, to enable the Olympic exclusion, and to respond to all of it with bureaucratic indifference put the league back on that curve. Whether it stays there depends on what comes next, whether the people in charge can finally reckon honestly with what happened, whether the culture of scarcity thinking can be replaced by something that matches the actual opportunity in front of the league, whether leadership can stop protecting the past and start building the future. Here's what's genuinely fascinating about where all of this leaves us. Caitlyn Clark doesn't need the WNBA to validate her. She never did. Her star power existed independently of the league, was demonstrated independently of the league, and will continue to grow independently of whatever decisions are made in league offices. She kept playing. She kept shooting those deep, ridiculous logo threes. She kept making passes that didn't seem physically possible. She kept drawing crowds and driving ratings and selling merchandise at numbers the league had never seen. The targeting didn't break her. The snub didn't silence her. The commissioner's indifference didn't diminish her. If anything, the adversity clarified something important. The relationship between Caitlyn Clark and the WNBA is not a balanced one. She needs them far less than they need her, and the sooner the people running that league genuinely internalize that reality, the better their chances of actually building something lasting around it. The fans who showed up for her are still there, slightly angrier, slightly more skeptical of the institution, but still watching, still filling seats in buildings that used to echo with the sound of modest crowds, still caring in a way they didn't care before she arrived. That is a remarkable thing, a gift, honestly, a second chance that most failing institutions don't get.
The question hanging over women's professional basketball right now is not whether Caitlyn Clark will be okay. She will be more than okay. The question is whether the people entrusted with the league she plays in are capable of the kind of honest, courageous, self-aware leadership that this moment demands. Because here's the uncomfortable truth that none of the press releases or carefully worded public statements will say out loud. The WNBA did not fail Caitlyn Clark. The WNBA failed itself. It failed the players who deserved better leadership. It failed the fans who showed up with genuine excitement and were repaid with politics and indifference. It failed the athletes of the next generation who were watching to see whether this league was a place worth dedicating a career to. Organizations rarely get the kind of opportunity the WNBA received when Caitlyn Clark entered the draft, the kind that reshapes the entire trajectory of a sport, the kind that turns a niche following into a mainstream movement, the kind that writes itself into history if you simply don't get in the way of it. They got in the way of it.
Whether that decision becomes a footnote or a eulogy depends entirely on what the people in charge decide to do next. But one thing is already certain and already permanent. The window that existed in the spring and summer of 2024, that specific, unrepeatable, once-in-a-generation window, is closed. You can't reconstruct the Paris Olympics. You can't undo the message that was sent to millions of new fans. You can't give back the hundreds of millions in brand value that evaporated because a committee prioritized ego over opportunity. History will record what the WNBA did with one of the rarest gifts a struggling league has ever received. And based on everything that actually happened, that record is going to make for very uncomfortable reading. If this video gave you something to think about, drop your thoughts in the comments. The conversation around what women's basketball could become and what's standing in the way is one worth having.